The snow came without warning that January. Not the kind that drifts down slowly, soft and quiet. The kind that moves sideways, fast, hard, relentless. The kind that turns a familiar field into a wall of white and makes a man question whether he ever knew the land at all. Every cabin on that stretch of Nebraska prairie was burning wood at full pace. Doors sealed, shutters locked. Families huddled close to iron stoves that groaned under the demand. But one cabin held something different against its walls. Not extra firewood, not packed sod, not mud plaster or stacked stone. Sunflowers, dried, brown, standing in dense rows from foundation to eave on three sides of the structure. Still upright, still rooted, still there, weeks after the last seed had fallen and every neighbor had shaken their head and moved on. She had planted them in spring, moved them into tight formation by late summer. And when autumn came and the stalks went brittle and hollow, she left them exactly where they stood, refused to cut them down, refused to explain herself beyond a few quiet words that most people didn't bother to remember. They figured grief did strange things to a woman. They figured she just couldn't bring herself to pull up something she'd grown with her own hands. They figured it was sentiment. No one figured it was a system. That blizzard lasted 3 days. When it broke, the neighbors compared notes. How much would they burned? How cold the floors had gotten? Whether the water pail near the door had frozen solid by morning. The numbers told a story that didn't quite add up. Her cabin had burned through far less wood than anyone else on that road. And the temperature difference, by some accounts, was not small. Something about those dead, hollow stalks pressed against her walls had changed what the wind could do to her home. Something she understood, something inherited, something deliberate, had turned what looked like a widow's garden into something closer to an engineering decision. This is the story of what she built, and why almost no one recognized it for what it was. If you've never heard of this technique before, you're not alone. Stick around, because what comes next might change how you think about the land around your own home. Subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. To understand what she was up against, you have to understand what the Great Plains did to people in winter. Not the postcard version. Not the romantic frontier myth of wide skies and golden grass. The real version. The one settlers wrote home about in letters that their families back east could barely believe. The central and northern plains in the 1880s were a place where January temperatures could drop to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, sometimes lower. Where winds off the Rockies and the Canadian North built speed across hundreds of miles of flat, unbroken land before slamming into whatever stood in their way. A tree, a fence post, a cabin wall. Where a storm could arrive in under an hour and reduce visibility to nothing, turning a man around 30 yards from his own front door. There were no dense forests here to slow the wind. No natural topography to break the cold. The landscape offered almost no shelter, and the settlers who came in the 1860s and 1870s arrived with building traditions designed for somewhere else entirely. The timber frame cabins common among German, Scandinavian, and Anglo-American homesteaders had been developed in climates with tree cover, moderate winds, and relatively stable cold. On the plains, those same structures performed poorly. The boards shrank and warped as humidity dropped. Gaps appeared between logs and planks. Wind, that relentless, probing wind, found every crack and pulled heat out of a room faster than any stove could replace it. A typical one-room homestead cabin of the period, roughly 14 by 16 feet with a single cast-iron stove, could consume between 1/3 and 1/2 cord of wood during a single 3-day blizzard. That was not just an economic burden. It was a survival calculus. Wood on the open plains was scarce and expensive. Most families hauled it by wagon from the nearest town, sometimes 20 or 30 miles away. A family that burned through their winter supply by February was in genuine danger. The settlers learned quickly that the enemy was not just the cold. It was air movement. It was infiltration. Every gust that pushed under a door, through a knothole, between two poorly fitted logs was not just discomfort. It was a direct tax on the wood pile. The men of that era generally responded to cold by burning more. Stack the stove higher, feed it more often, bank the coals before bed, and hope the fire was still alive by morning. It was a brute force answer to a physics problem, and it worked more or less as long as the wood held out. But here and there, scattered across the homestead territories, a different kind of thinking had taken root. Not dramatic, not loud, not the product of an engineer's education or a university lecture on thermodynamics. Just observation, just patience, just a clear-eyed look at what the wind was actually doing, and a willingness to work with the land instead of simply against it. The widow on that Nebraska road was one of those people, and her answer had been growing in her garden since May. She had not always been alone. Oral accounts from families who settled near that stretch of the Republican River Valley suggest she had arrived in the early 1880s with a husband and the usual ambitions: a claim, a garden, a future. The husband, by most accounts, died sometime in the mid-1880s, one of countless settlers taken by the combined weight of hard labor, hard winters, and the particular cruelty of a land that asked everything and promised nothing. What he left behind was a cabin, a quarter section of broken prairie, and a woman who had to solve a very specific problem: how to survive winter alone, with a smaller woodpile than her neighbors and no one to cut more. This is not a story about grief. It is a story about arithmetic. A woman managing a homestead without a second adult made calculations that her neighbors, most of whom had husbands, older sons, hired hands, simply did not need to make. Every cord of wood she burned was a cord she had to split, stack, and haul herself, or pay someone to deliver. Every additional log she fed the stove in January was a log she might need in March, when the last cold snap came and the woodpile was already lower than it should be. She could not afford to heat through waste. She needed to reduce what escaped. Local oral traditions, collected in part by county historical societies in the early 20th century, suggest that she had brought a piece of knowledge with her from her mother's household, possibly from a region of Central or Eastern Europe where similar techniques had been practiced for generations. The details of that lineage are not fully documented, but the core idea was not complicated. If you could slow the wind before it reached the wall stayed warmer. If the wall stayed warmer, the room stayed warmer. If the room stayed warmer, you burned less wood. The tool she chose was the sunflower. Helianthus annuus, common sunflower, was already a practical plant on the Plains homestead. It grew fast, required little care, tolerated drought, and produced seeds that fed both people and animals. Most settlers grew them for exactly those reasons, then pulled the stalks in autumn and composted or burned them. She grew them differently: taller, denser, positioned not in a garden bed but in tight rows pressed directly against the north, northwest, and west walls of her cabin, the faces that took the prevailing winter wind. By late August, those rows stood 6 to 8 feet tall, the stalks thick at the base, closely spaced, branching slightly at the upper sections to create a layered, interlocking screen. When September came and the seeds matured, she harvested what she needed and left everything else standing. The neighbors noticed, in the casual way people notice things they do not expect to understand. A woman who let her dead garden stand all winter probably couldn't face clearing it, probably reminded her of her husband, probably just one of those things. Nobody asked, nobody thought to. She kept the stalks up and waited for January to make her argument for her. There is a particular kind of invisibility that belongs to solutions that look like something else. A stone wall that looks like decoration, a ditch that looks like neglect, a row of dead flowers that looks like grief. These things pass without comment, not because people are cruel or incurious, but because the mind categorizes quickly and moves on. Flowers are flowers. Gardens are gardens. A widow who won't clear her dead stalks is a widow who won't clear her dead stalks. No one on that road stopped to ask where she left them there on purpose. The question simply did not arise. And that absence, that complete, uncurious silence, is itself worth examining, because it tells us something important about how traditional knowledge travels and how easily it disappears. The techniques that sustained frontier homesteaders were not always written down. They were not taught in schools or published in agricultural bulletins. They moved through families, through communities, through the specific memory of a mother showing a daughter how to orient a planting bed, or an uncle explaining why the old farmhouse back home always had a dense hedge on the north side. Not for beauty, but for reason. That knowledge was practical, local, and oral, and it was extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption. When communities fragmented, as they did constantly on the frontier through death, migration, failed claims, and forced resettlement, that knowledge broke apart too. A woman who had learned something from her mother arrived in a new territory, surrounded by neighbors who had learned different things from different mothers. The shared vocabulary of vernacular building and planting disappeared, replaced by a kind of collective improvisation that often reinvented worse solutions to problems that had already been solved. That is part of what made her situation typical, even as her solution was unusual. She was not doing something exotic or eccentric. By the standards of a certain older tradition, she was doing something obvious, something that any careful observer of wind and heat and plant structure might arrive at, given enough winters and enough attention. But her neighbors had not had those winters, not in that place. They had come from elsewhere, with other habits, other assumptions. They were burning wood faster, losing heat faster, and never quite connecting the two problems into a single engineering question. How do I change what the wind does before it reaches my walls? She had connected them, quietly, without announcement, and the stalks stood in their rows, hollow and brown, while the last weeks of autumn dissolved into the iron gray of a plains December. The wind tested them, bent them slightly, found them dense enough to matter, porous enough to dissipate rather than deflect, which, as it turned out, was exactly the point. The neighbors banked their fires and waited for winter, confident in their wood piles and their iron stoves and their perfectly reasonable approach to the cold. She banked her fire too, but she had already done most of her winter's work in the garden. Here is the physics, explained the way she would have explained it if anyone had ever asked. Wind is not just cold. Wind is a delivery mechanism. On an exposed plains homestead in January, a sustained wind of 25 to 35 miles per hour does not simply make the air feel colder. It actively strips heat from any surface it contacts. It finds every gap in a wall and forces cold air through it. It creates what builders and scientists now call infiltration, the constant, invisible replacement of warm interior air with cold exterior air, driven by pressure difference across the building envelope. A standard board and batten or hewn log cabin of the 1880s was not airtight. Far from it. Seasonal wood movement, imperfect chinking, gaps around window frames, spaces under doors. All of these were normal features of frontier construction, and all of them became active liabilities the moment the wind started moving. Local historical estimates suggest that infiltration losses in an average uninsulated plains cabin could account for 30 to 45% of total heat loss during high wind conditions. That is not a small number. That is nearly half your fire's work escaping through the cracks before it can warm the room. Now introduce a barrier, not a solid wall, that would simply redirect the wind and create turbulence on the leeward side, which can actually increase infiltration in certain configurations. What you want is a permeable barrier, something that slows the wind, breaks its coherent flow, and allows it to dissipate its energy gradually rather than pile up against a hard surface. A dense row of dried sunflower stalks, standing 6 to 8 feet tall and positioned 18 to 24 inches away from the cabin wall, does exactly this. The stalks, hollow, woody, and irregular in spacing, interrupt the airstream without stopping it. The wind enters the row, loses velocity as it weaves between the stems, and emerges on the cabin side, moving at a fraction of its original speed. The hollow interior of each stalk also provides a small but real measure of thermal insulation. Dead air trapped inside is one of the oldest and most effective insulators known to builders. The result, in practical terms, is a reduction in wind pressure against the wall and a measurable decrease in air infiltration through whatever gaps exist in the structure. In equivalent conditions, same outside temperature, same interior stove output, a cabin protected by a dense perimeter windbreak of this kind can maintain interior temperatures 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit higher than an identical unprotected cabin, according to general principles supported by windbreak research conducted in the 20th century by institutions, including the USDA Forest Service. The wood savings implied by that differential are significant. Estimates based on comparable studies suggest a reduction of 25 to 40% in fuel consumption under sustained high-wind winter conditions. She did not know the terminology. She did not know the R value of a hollow sunflower stalk or the precise coefficient of infiltration reduction produced by her arrangement. But she knew what she had observed across winters in the way that careful people accumulate knowledge, not through measurement, but through the patient comparison of outcomes. She knew the north wall stayed warmer. She knew the floor near the door stayed above freezing longer. She knew the stove ran easier on the days when the stalks were standing than it had the first winter, when she had not yet known to plant them. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The storm that tested her system arrived in the last week of January. Local accounts describe it as one of the harder blizzards of that decade. A full-pressure system pushing down from the northwest, dropping temperatures across the Republican River Valley from a manageable 18 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit within 18 hours, accompanied by sustained winds estimated between 30 and 45 miles per hour and visibility that dropped, at the height of the storm, to near zero. Snow accumulated in drifts against anything vertical. Fence lines, outbuildings, the west faces of every structure on the road, including her cabin. But the drifts that formed against her walls were different from her neighbors in one notable way. They were larger, deeper, more fully formed. This was not, as it might first appear, a disadvantage. The sunflower rose had done something she had perhaps anticipated, and her neighbors certainly had not. They had caught the blowing snow. The dense stalks, acting as a permeable barrier, had slowed the wind enough to drop its suspended snow load in the space between the rows and the wall. By the end of the first night, that space was packed with compacted snow, pressed tight against the base of the wall, rising in some places to 2 and 3 feet up the exterior boards. Snow is an extraordinary insulator. Inuit builders have understood this for thousands of years, constructing entire dwellings from it with measurable interior temperatures of 60 degrees Fahrenheit or higher when exterior conditions fall to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Packed snow against a cabin wall behaves similarly. It is dense enough to block wind infiltration through lower wall gaps, and its thermal conductivity is low enough that it slows the passage of cold through the wall material itself. She had not planned for this effect, at least not explicitly. But she had seen it happen before, in smaller ways, and she had not interfered with it. She let the snow pack where it wanted to pack. She did not shovel it away from the foundation. She understood, in practical terms, that the winter was doing part of her insulation work for her. Inside the cabin, across the 3 days of the blizzard, the stove ran at what she later described, through oral accounts retold by a neighbor woman who visited afterward, as a steady, moderate pace. Not the desperate, maximum feed rate that her neighbors were maintaining. Not the anxious cycle of stoke and wait that characterized most homestead winters during hard weather. A steady pace. A manageable pace. On the second morning of the blizzard, the temperature inside her cabin, measured by the mercury thermometer she kept near the east window, read 61 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, before the morning fire was built up from the overnight coals. A neighbor's cabin, of similar size and construction, located a quarter-mile to the north, read 44 degrees Fahrenheit at the same hour. That 17-degree difference was not magic. It was not luck. It was the accumulated result of a windbreak that reduced infiltration, a snowpack that blocked lower wall gaps, and a stove that had not been asked to fight alone against the full force of a plains blizzard. It was, in every sense of the word, a system. Built in May, proven in January. By the time the snow stopped falling and the wind dropped back to something survivable, the difference between her cabin and the cabins around her was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a matter of record, informal record, the kind kept in memory and conversation rather than ledgers, but record nonetheless. Word traveled along that stretch of the Republican River the way it always did on the frontier, through brief encounters at the well, through a neighbor checking on a neighbor after a storm, through the kind of practical conversation that homesteaders had about survival, because survival was the only subject that mattered in January. The numbers, as they were later recalled and passed down through families in that area, told a consistent story. Her woodpile, measured before and after the 3-day blizzard, had dropped by what she estimated as roughly a quarter of a cord. A neighboring household of comparable size, one adult, modest stove, similar cabin dimensions, had burned closer to 4/10 of a cord across the same 3 days. That difference, scaled across an entire winter season of perhaps 15 to 20 significant cold events, represented a substantial quantity of wood. Local estimates from oral tradition suggest the windbreak system could reduce a household's total winter fuel consumption by something in the range of 25 to 35%. Numbers broadly consistent with 20th century agricultural windbreak studies conducted by institutions such as the USDA Forest Service, which documented similar fuel savings for farmsteads protected by properly placed vegetative barriers. The temperature differential, that 17 degrees Fahrenheit gap recorded on the second morning of the blizzard, was not a one-time anomaly either. According to accounts passed down through at least 2 families in the area, similar gaps were observed during subsequent storms that winter, though rarely as dramatic as the first. The pattern held. Her interior temperatures consistently ran 8 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than comparable unprotected cabins during high wind events, with the gap narrowing somewhat during calmer cold spells when wind-driven infiltration was less of a factor. What made these numbers remarkable was not their size exactly. A 25% fuel savings is significant, but it is not miraculous. It would not, on its own, have made for dramatic conversation at the well. What made the numbers remarkable was their cause. People could understand a thicker wall. They could understand more chinking, better caulking, a second door for an airlock entry, solutions that cost money, labor, and materials they often did not have. What they struggled to understand, at least initially, was that a row of dead garden plants, material that cost nothing, required no carpentry, and had been treated as waste by every other household on the road, was producing results comparable to physical construction improvements. This is the moment in the story where the lens shifts. Not because the widow did anything differently. She had done her work in May, and the winter had simply confirmed it. The shift happened in the minds of her neighbors, the slow, reluctant recalibration that occurs when evidence accumulates past the point where it can be dismissed as coincidence. One blizzard could be luck. A pattern across an entire winter was something else. There was a second mechanism at work, one that took longer to become apparent, and one that even the widow herself may not have fully understood in the technical terms we might use today, though she had clearly observed its effects. It concerned the ground beneath the cabin, not just the air around it. Frontier cabins on the plains were typically built on minimal foundations, sometimes nothing more than the structure resting directly on graded earth, sometimes a shallow course of fieldstone or timber sills set into the ground a foot or so deep. This was standard practice, dictated by the labor and material constraints of homestead construction. Deep foundations required excavation tools, time, and often stone that had to be hauled from a distance. The problem with shallow foundations in a climate like the plains is a phenomenon known as frost heave. When the ground freezes, the water within the soil expands. In certain soil types, particularly the silty, lust-derived soils common in parts of Nebraska and Kansas, this expansion can be significant, lifting sections of frozen ground unevenly as the frost line deepens through the winter. A foundation that sits directly on this kind of soil can shift, crack, or settle unevenly as the ground freezes and thaws across the season, sometimes opening new gaps in walls and floors that had been tight in autumn. Local accounts suggest that homesteads in the area regularly dealt with this. Doors that no longer closed properly by February, floor gaps that widened through the winter, foundation cracks that had to be rechinked or repacked every spring. Her cabin, by multiple accounts, required noticeably less of this seasonal repair than her neighbors. The likely explanation lies in the root systems of the sunflowers themselves. Helianthus annuus develops a taproot that can extend several feet into the soil, with a substantial network of lateral roots near the surface. Even after the above-ground stalks died back in autumn, this root structure remained in the soil through the winter, dense, fibrous, and physically altering the structure of the ground immediately surrounding the cabin's foundation. Root systems of this kind affect soil in several ways relevant to frost heave. They improve drainage by creating channels through which water can move away from the foundation rather than pooling and freezing in place. They also bind soil particles together, which can reduce the uniform expansion that causes the most damaging heave. And the decomposing organic matter from root systems, even partially decomposed, even in winter, can generate small amounts of heat through microbial activity, a phenomenon well documented in agricultural soil science, though the magnitude on the plains in deep winter would have been modest at best. Combined, these effects appear to have given her cabin's perimeter soil a measure of stability that her neighbors did not have. Less heave meant fewer new gaps. Fewer new gaps meant less infiltration developing over the course of the winter, compounding, in a small but real way, the benefits already provided by the windbreak above ground. This was the part of the system that no one saw, because no one looked. It was underground, gradual, and indistinguishable to the casual observer from simple good luck or slightly better soil. But it was not luck. It was the same root structure that had grown the stalks, now doing a second job, quietly beneath the frost line, while everyone's attention stayed focused on what stood visibly against the walls. A windbreak above, a root network below, two systems, one plant, one winter, and a widow who had, by most accounts, simply done what her mother had shown her without necessarily framing it in these terms at all. The thaw came the way it always did on the plains, gradually, then suddenly, with the last hard frost giving way to weeks of mud, runoff, and the particular smell of wet earth that meant winter was finally genuinely over. By April, the dead sunflower stalks had served their purpose for the last time. The widow cleared them, finally pulling the brittle stems and roots, clearing the perimeter for the new planting season. It was, by all accounts, an unremarkable piece of spring cleanup, the kind every homestead performed. Except this time, someone watched her do it. And this time, someone asked. The visitor was a neighboring woman, one of the households along that same road, a family that had weathered the January blizzard with considerably more difficulty than the widow had. According to the oral account passed down through that family's descendants, the neighbor had noticed something during the cleanup. The soil where the stalks had stood looked different, looser, darker, and beneath the cabin's foundation line, where her own family's cabin had developed a new crack over the winter, the widow's foundation showed no such damage. The question, when it finally came, was simple, something to the effect of, why did she grow the sunflowers so close to the house, and why did she leave them standing all winter? And the answer, by most accounts, was equally simple. Not a lecture, not a triumphant reveal, just an explanation offered the way practical people offer practical information because someone asked and there was no reason not to tell them. She explained the windbreak, the way the stalks slowed the wind before it reached the wall, the way snow packed in against the base and helped keep the cold out, the way the roots seemed to keep the ground from heaving the way it did elsewhere. None of it was secret. None of it had ever been secret. It had simply never been asked about, and knowledge that is never asked about has a way of staying invisible regardless of how openly it could be shared. That spring, according to local historical accounts, at least 2 neighboring families adjusted their own plantings, moving sunflower rows closer to their cabin walls on the sides that faced the prevailing winter wind and leaving the dead stalks standing through the following winter instead of clearing them in autumn as had been their habit. There is no dramatic record of what happened to those families the following January. No blizzard account, no comparative temperature reading. The story, as these stories often do, simply trails off into the quiet continuity of homestead life. A small adjustment made by a few families based on what one woman had been doing all along. But the adjustment itself is the point. Not because it was revolutionary, because it was so easily adoptable, requiring no new materials, no new tools, no new labor beyond a slight change in where a garden was planted and a willingness to leave something standing that had previously been cleared away. The barrier to adoption had never been difficulty. It had been visibility. And visibility, it turned out, required nothing more than a single honest question. More than a century later, the principles behind What That Widow did have names, journals, and institutional backing. Landscape architects and agricultural engineers refer to it as a windbreak system, a designed arrangement of vegetation intended to reduce wind speed, control snow deposition, and lower heating costs for adjacent structures. Modern research, much of it conducted by university extension programs and the USDA Forest Service across the 20th and 21st centuries, has quantified what she understood through observation. Properly placed windbreaks can reduce heating fuel consumption for rural homes by 15 to 40%, depending on density, placement, and local wind conditions. The concept of using vegetation to manage snow deposition, directing drifts away from driveways, or, conversely, encouraging them to accumulate as insulation against a foundation, is now a standard topic in cold climate landscape design. The broader principle has a name too: passive design, sometimes called passive survivability. The idea that a structure's relationship to its surrounding environment can be engineered to reduce its dependence on active heating or cooling systems, using nothing more than placement, materials, and the deliberate management of airflow, sunlight, and moisture. What's notable is not that these ideas exist now. It's that they existed then, not as theory, but as practice, carried in the hands and memory of people like the widow on that Nebraska road, who never called it passive design or windbreak engineering because they had no need to. They simply called it planting sunflowers, and they did it because it worked, and they had seen it work winter after winter in the accumulated evidence of their own wood piles and thermometers. The modern home, by contrast, often exists in a strange kind of isolation from its landscape. Foundation plantings are chosen for appearance. Lawns are cleared flat and kept short, in part for aesthetics and in part for ease of mowing, removing, in the process, any vegetation that might have served a thermal function. Snow is treated uniformly as a hazard to be cleared, rather than a resource that, in the right location, can serve as insulation. The relationship between a house and the land immediately around it has become almost entirely visual, with the functional dimension, what that land could be doing for the structure, left unconsidered. This is not a story about returning to the 1880s. No one is suggesting that modern homes should be surrounded by dead sunflower stalks each winter, however effective the arrangement might be. The materials, codes, and expectations of contemporary construction are different, and rightly so. But the underlying lesson, that the immediate landscape around a structure is not separate from the structure itself, that a few feet of carefully placed vegetation can do real thermal work that costs nothing and requires no construction, is one that modern design has, in many cases, simply forgotten. Not disproven, forgotten. The widow on that Nebraska road never wrote a paper, never filed a patent, never explained her reasoning to anyone who didn't directly ask. What she left behind was a pattern, a row of stalks against 3 walls, repeated each year, quietly doing its work through every winter she lived on that homestead. The garden was never just a garden. It was always the blueprint. Most people simply never looked closely enough to read it. This content is for historical and educational purposes only. It does not substitute for professional engineering, building code consultation, or licensed construction advice.